Happy New Year and welcome to this edition of History and Highballs, the history of the ice in your drink. My name is Stacy and I handle adult education here at the North Carolina Museum of History. For tonight's program, we ask that you please type any questions that you have for our guest speaker into the chat function located at the bottom center of your screen. At the end of the program, our adult programs intern will ask our speaker as many of your questions as time allows. So it's my honor to welcome our guest speaker this evening, Dr. Robert Allison. Dr. Allison holds a BA, MA, and PhD from Harvard University and is a professor of history at Suffolk University. His books include The Boston Tea Party, 2007, The Boston Massacre, 2006, Stephen Decatur, American Naval Hero, 2005, A Short History of Boston, 2004, and The American Revolution, A Very Short Introduction, 2015. He has also created two courses for the Great Courses, Before 1776, Life in Colonial America, and The Age of Benjamin Franklin. Dr. Allison chairs Revolution 250, a consortium of Massachusetts organizations commemorating the revolution's semiquincentennial, and is president of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. Welcome, Dr. Allison. Thanks for being with us this evening.
Thank you very much, Stacy. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thank you to the North Carolina Museum of History for organizing this series. And so I'm going to be talking a bit about the history of ice. And to understand this, first we need to look at how New England's economy began. New England, as you can probably know, does not have a great climate. We don't have real good raw materials, a climate that's conducive to producing crops for export. So New Englanders were always looking for something else that they could trade some in other parts of the world. And in the colonial period, actually, New Englanders did very well trading with the West Indies. Of course, if we were anywhere in the British Empire in the 18th century thinking about the colonies and the empire, we wouldn't be thinking about Massachusetts. Might not even be thinking about North Carolina. We would be thinking about the West Indies because they were producing the sugar that was making the British Empire prosper. And New Englanders discovered that they had something they could trade to the West Indies, and that was codfish. And doing very well at this until the end of the 18th century, when the West Indies were not so interested in codfish. And this brings us to a man named Frederic Tudor. Tudor was a Bostonian. His father was a very prominent judge in colonial Massachusetts, revolutionary Massachusetts. He was a law pupil of John Adams's. And Frederic was the only one of his 6 sons who did not go to Harvard. He visited Harvard where his brother was a student. His brother was actually a roommate of a man named Washington Allston, then a college student who was becoming a painter. And Frederic Tudor saw this guy's college dorm room filled with paintbrushes and canvases, and he thought, boy, college is a place for a lot of loafers. He wasn't going to go to college. So instead, Frederic Tudor went to work. At the age of 13, he went into business. And he was trading in the West Indies, going to the West Indies, selling codfish and bringing back things like mahogany, sugar, other luxury goods from the Caribbean, and doing pretty well for himself. But at the end of the 18th century, the market for codfish in the West Indies was not as lucrative as the market in Boston was for mahogany, sugar, and other things. So clearly, New Englanders needed something else that they could sell in the West Indies. And Frederic Tudor gets the idea of selling ice. Now, New England has a lot of ice in the wintertime, and New Englanders had begun actually getting ice and storing it in ice houses, and other people had caught on to this idea. George Washington built an ice house at Mount Vernon. And on the days in the winter when there actually was ice around or snow around in Mount Vernon, then he would fill the ice house with it and then keep it over the course of the year, really until the midsummer when it all would have melted. You dig it into the ground, insulate it, and then keep ice. And Frederic Tudor gets the idea that if you can keep ice into the middle of the summer, you could also pack it aboard a ship and send it somewhere where they don't have ice. And again, he's had experience in the Caribbean, so he knows that there is no ice there, no chance of getting ice there. Although apparently France had been sending ice cream to Trinidad, packing it in a certain way. And also they noticed that some of the lumber being brought from New England to the West Indies still had ice on it if it was cut during the winter. So they know that ice actually can travel that long distance. And so he figures out a way to do this. Actually, it's not an easy thing. He sends his brother down to the Caribbean, to the island of Martinique, where he wants his brother to get people to subscribe to buy ice. For $50, you'll get 200 pounds of ice. $50 at that time would be worth about $1,200 today. So it's not an insignificant investment. The problem is there's no place to keep the ice in the West Indies. He sends his brother and another friend, a fellow named William Savage, who is a cousin actually, to the West Indies, hoping that they will get both a monopoly on the trade of ice from the various islands in the Caribbean, from the French islands and the Spanish islands, and then also enlist subscribers. So in the winter of 1805, 1806, William Tudor and James Savage are in the West Indies. It's a fraught winter for them. Savage actually comes down with yellow fever and is incapacitated for most of the time. William Tudor doesn't do as much selling as his brother would have liked. And meanwhile, William Tudor is in Boston trying to arrange for the cutting of ice from one of the ponds nearby to Boston to ship to the West Indies in March of 1806. And all winter, while his brother and cousin are in the West Indies, Frederic Tudor is in Boston, and every morning his father, the eminent judge, will tell him, this is really a bad idea. You're not going to make any money of this. This is going to be a big disaster. So he has every morning his brother doing this, and his, meanwhile, he doesn't know what his brother and cousin are doing there in the West Indies. So not an easy winter for Frederic Tudor, but in February, he does have a ship ready to sail with about 130 tons of ice for Martinique, and it gets there, and it's really not a successful voyage. The problem in Martinique is there's no place to store ice. Tudor said that you could have he could have sold the entire cargo for $10,000 if there had been an ice house in Martinique. He and his brother had discussed building an ice house, but he didn't want to do that. So he didn't want to tip his hand that they're actually going to be importing ice. And so you, as a purchaser, are getting a 200-pound block of ice, and then what do you do with it? And Tudor said that people will do anything they can to make sure the ice melts. That is, they'll go to pick up the ice at noon, and then they'll put it in front of their house, and the ice is melting. The voyage is something of a debacle. He loses about $3,000 or $4,000 on it, but it shows that this actually could work. And there is one resort, the Tivoli Gardens, and the proprietor of the Tivoli Gardens had purchased ice from Tudor, and he sells about $1,200 worth of ice cream in one night. That's an amazing profit for the owner of the Tivoli Garden. That is, if you have ice and you actually know what to do with the ice, you can make quite a bit of money with it. So it convinces Frederic Tudor that this is actually going to work out. By the way, when he had first started with this idea of shipping ice, he kept a journal, the Ice House Journal. The manuscript survives in the Massachusetts Historical Society. And he has a little quote at the beginning of it that he who gives at the first obstacle or doesn't punch back is never going to be a hero in love, war, or business. So Frederic Tudor is a pugnacious guy who is ready to give back and punch back at any obstacle. And this first voyage, which is a disaster, convinces him that this actually is going to work. So he persists, and he is cutting ice. He persists despite actually real obstacles. He doesn't make much money for the first 15 years when he is doing this, partly because of the problem of not having ice houses in Martinique or in Havana. He gets a monopoly from the Spanish government for all the ice shipped to Havana. And also there's an embargo in 1807, shutting down American trade, War of 1812. Tudor winds up in debtor's prison in 1812. His father, by the way, the eminent judge, also goes broke with bad real estate investments. So the family is struggling financially. They had an estate in what is today Saugus, Massachusetts, which they have to sell at auction in 1807. And Frederic Tudor tries other things. Some of them seem wildly impractical. Coal mining on Martha's Vineyard, a lead mine in the town of Sturbridge, and other things, but he comes back in the late 18 teens to shipping ice to the tropics. And this time he does better with it. He sends a shipment of ice to New Orleans, and he will give ice to bartenders, show it for a year, showing them how to mix drinks. That is creating a demand for this ice. And one of the surest ways of creating a demand is through mixed drinks. In fact, he invents a drink called the smash, which we can talk about later. So creating a taste for ice, a demand for ice, and the only real source of ice at this time is our friend Frederic Tudor. When he was first setting off with this idea, he had gone to one of the eminent Bostonians, a man named Harrison Gray Otis, for both advice, but he also wanted Otis to invest in this. And Otis said, yeah, it's a plausible scheme. He was not going to invest. Tudor also wanted to patent the whole method of shipping ice, but Otis said, no, you probably shouldn't patent it. I don't know how you would patent his particular method, figuring out how actually to keep the ice cold over a long voyage. They learned that if you keep the hold shut, you insulate it. First, they insulated with straw, which is what they would have used in the ice houses of New England. But then Tudor learns that sawdust is actually a better insulation for the blocks of ice that he's being shipping now from the ponds of Massachusetts down to New Orleans or to Trinidad or Martinique or these other ports. So Tudor, by the 1820s, is actually making a business of this. Also in the 1820s, he meets a man named Nathaniel Wyeth. And Nathaniel Wyeth is another of these New England tinkerers. And Wyeth comes up with actually tools to use to cut ice. A sled that has a way of scoring the ice pulled by horses across a pond, and then saws that can be used to cut the ice. And you'll cut these blocks of ice. When the ice is about 2 feet thick, you can go and start cutting the blocks, having this team of horses drag the sled across the ice to score it. Then men will saw these blocks of ice and making a channel, which you then push these cubes of ice down this channel into the ice house. And Tudor has a wharf built in Charlestown, Massachusetts, Tudor Wharf, and a railroad built to it in the 1830s. So the real reason we have a railroad from Concord and points west into Boston was to bring cubes of ice down to Frederic Tudor's wharf. And then the ice is going to be shipped not only to other ports in the United States, but to other ports around the world. So Tudor Wharf, Henry David Thoreau is on Walden Pond watching the ice cutters when he spends a year there in the 1840s. So you have Frederic Tudor making a real market for ice in other places. And by the 1840s and 1850s, ice was the second biggest American export. That is, American ships, the leading American export was cotton. The second biggest export in terms of tonnage was ice. And just think about the benefit of this to this New England economy. Here is something that doesn't cost anything to produce. It does cost something to harvest out of the pond, but every year you have ice. There are a couple of warm winters where there's not enough ice, and then that one of those particular winters, Tudor sends the ship that was going to go to the West Indies carrying cubes of ice from New England ponds up to Newfoundland and has the captain get ice off of an iceberg. That is, he knows there's a market in the West Indies for ice, and he will get it one way or another. And the ice business really does take off in the 1830s. And Tudor also then starts creating an infrastructure for ice, building ice houses in different places, different parts of the world. So, for example, there is an ice house in Calcutta. In 1833, Tudor sends a shipment of ice to Calcutta in India and builds an ice house there, another ice house in Bombay, and another in Chennai. And all of these are Tudor properties. In the 1840s, an ice house in Hong Kong. And in fact, there still is an ice house street in Hong Kong. I believe the American consulate is on Ice House Street. Two pieces of America in Hong Kong. One is the ice house and the other is the consulate. Both started there in the 1840s. Henry David Thoreau, when he knew that this ice being cut on Walden Pond was going to India, wrote about how the pure Walden water is now mingled with the sacred water of the river Ganges, seeing this connection of New England with far parts of the world. Samuel Eliot Morison, the 20th century historian, saw this a little more pragmatically for New England. The Tudor and his ice, he said, came about just in time to save Boston's East India trade from ruin. The carrying trade between Calcutta and America and between Europe and New England had declined almost to extinction. And for a generation after the Civil War, the ice and the export trade increased and prospered. And every New England village with a pond that was near the tidewater was able to turn this Yankee liability, ice, into an asset through the genius of Frederic Tudor. So Tudor helps revive a New England trading economy. And he also sees that if you're bringing ice to Calcutta or to Hong Kong or to Martinique, you also can bring fresh produce and fresh meat and vegetables and fruit from New England to these other places. So it's a real boon for the American economy, creating a market for ice in other places and actually expanding American trade to other parts of the far-flung world. So Tudor is a very tough businessman. He understands business, as he wants to get monopolies in these places and doesn't want anyone else horning in. But once the method is discovered, other people can ship ice as well. Now, other people are thinking about ways to manufacture ice, and we'll turn our attention now to Apalachicola, Florida. And Apalachicola did import ice from New England. Apalachicola, now a very pleasant town on the Gulf of Mexico, at this time was actually the third or fourth busiest port on the Gulf, following New Orleans and Mobile, exporting cotton. And it's in a marshy area. And so it's kind of a boom town during the time when cotton is being exported. Rest of the year, it's kind of a sleepy southern town on the Gulf Coast. And Dr. John Gorrie, a man of somewhat mysterious origins, he might have been born in the West Indies, might have been born in Charleston, South Carolina. He might have gone to medical school in Pennsylvania, or he might have gone in New York. What we know is along about the late 1830s, he arrived in Apalachicola. And he is a doctor, and he becomes one of the leading citizens of the town. And one of the big problems in Apalachicola was, of course, the climate. Just as the climate was a problem in New England, the climate was a problem in Apalachicola. It gets very hot and humid during the summer, surrounded by marshland. And one of the persistent problems were yellow fever and malaria epidemics. And no one at the time knew what caused yellow fever or malaria. They knew there was a seasonal quality to them. Late summer was the worst time of year. And the word malaria, you probably know, comes from the Italian for bad air. The thinking was it's bad air from the swamps that causes this disease. We now know it was mosquitoes. And so one method that Gorrie wanted to do to eradicate this disease or mitigate it was to clear the swamps, not thinking that's because that's where the mosquitoes are, but because that's where the bad air comes from. But the other thing he wanted to do was keep his patients cool. malaria, yellow fever, both involve, of course, your temperature, bodily temperature fluctuates. And what he wants to do is keep his patients comfortable. And the way to do that would be to get a block of ice and blow air across it to cool the patient's room. And what happens in the late 1830s, early 1840s is the ice shipments aren't coming in. Ice is more expensive. You know, a pound of cotton at this time would sell in Apalachicola for 8 cents. A pound of ice sold for 10 cents. So the Yankee captains bringing ice in, trading for cotton, are actually doing better than the cotton merchants who are in Apalachicola, because cotton is, as one Southern statesman said, cotton is king. Well, actually, ice was king. And Gorrie is thinking about ways of keeping the patients cool if they don't have ice. And this would involve a problem in physics. And this is something that natural philosophers had realized in the 18th century, that different gases expand and contract at different temperatures. Now, I'm not a scientist myself, as you can probably tell by the fact I couldn't figure out how to work a PowerPoint. But when gases contract, they get cooler. And then when they expand, they heat up, meaning they absorb heat from the area around them, from whatever's around them. And so different physicists were experimenting with this idea of refrigeration. That is a way of making a gas expand so it will absorb the heat in the surrounding area as it expands. And then as you contract it, you're extracting the heat from it. And then you can go through this process again. And Gorrie invents a machine that will do this, actually using a steam engine to contract the gas and then allow the gas to expand in a way that is going to absorb the heat surrounding the patient. He's doing this as a way of keeping the patient's room cool. Now, according to one local legend, Dr. Gorrie left the machine on and the next morning discovered that it was coated in ice. So he realized not only had he figured out a way to keep a patient cool, he had figured out a way to create ice, something that it seemed like only God could do or a New England winter could do. And Gorrie's immediate idea is this would be something really useful in the American ice business, not only for keeping patients cool and not only for serving cool drinks in Apalachicola and other places. In fact, there's a story of, I think it was 1840 or 1841, a Bastille Day celebration in Apalachicola. And there was a French consul in Apalachicola. He was also a cotton broker and was very disappointed that for Bastille Day, they were going to have to drink warm wine. But Monsieur Bazar, the consul, says, no, 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 we will give people what they want, which is a cool drink. And thanks to Dr. Gorrie's machine, they are able to cool the wine for this Bastille Day, July in Apalachicola, Florida. That seems like a miracle to everyone present. So Gorrie, knowing that this is a valuable thing, goes to get financial backing to perfect his machine in Boston, the center of the ice trade, not realizing that the last thing Frederic Tudor wants is someone who can manufacture ice, since what Tudor has wanted is a monopoly on the production of ice coming from the ponds of New England. And here you have this guy in Florida saying, well, I can manufacture ice. So it's a little bit mysterious who exactly in Boston our friend Dr. Gorrie goes to for help with his ice machine. But we do know that possibly Frederic Tudor begins sending things to the newspaper about this crank in Florida who thinks he can manufacture ice, suggesting that Dr. Gorrie is mentally unbalanced. Gorrie knows this is a smear campaign, and he decides not to go back to Boston for help with his invention. Instead, he goes to New Orleans, which is a more conducive place for it. But having bankrupted himself and his family in the pursuit of this machine, he winds up dying in New Orleans, both in obscurity and in poverty. Now, meanwhile, the French consul in Apalachicola had gone back to France, and there he has a colleague, Ferdinand Carré. And Monsieur Carré is a physicist who's been developing a refrigeration technique. And so he knows about Gorrie's experiment. Gorrie had patented his machine in 1851, and Carré, well, in 1864, Gorrie's patent expired, and that year Carré patents his own invention to make ice using ammonia. There's some modifications in Gorrie's experiment, and we shouldn't say that Carré, the Frenchman, actually got the idea from him. But by the late 1850s, early 1860s, the French are manufacturing machines to make ice. And this is at about the same time that, of course, the Civil War is beginning, and Frederic Tudor is coming to the end of his life in the early 1860s. And in 1864, a brave fellow in Augusta, Georgia, brings a French ice-making machine through the Union blockade and starts manufacturing ice in Augusta, Georgia. This is, of course, bad news for Frederic Tudor, who dies in the same year. Good news for the people of Augusta. And after the Civil War, we see ice manufacturing beginning in other parts of the American South. No reason for ice manufacturing in New England or places where the ice occurs naturally, but the development of ice machines pretty much puts the New England ice trade out of business by the 1870s or so. So this is what's going on with ice in the 18th century through the years of the Civil War. Now, in New Orleans, the city of New Orleans actually builds an ice plant to manufacture ice. And other southern cities also start developing ice plants to produce ice, which seemed to be more of a necessity in the southern states, which get very warm during the winter. And in other countries, too, can now manufacture ice. And what happens to the ice business is a story for another day. Let me just say that Gorrie lives on, despite the fact that he died in ignominious poverty in the middle of the 1850s. In the early 20th century, a ship captain in Pensacola, he had been a steamboat captain along the Apalachicola River. He's an adventuresome Yankee from actually upstate New York, and he had gone down to Georgia after the Civil War, become a steamboat captain. Then by the 1890s, he'd settled down in Apalachicola and started an ice business, manufacturing ice. And he realized how important Dr. Gorrie was to the ice business. And of course, he's filled with local pride about Gorrie and his invention in the 1840s, 1850s. And so this adventuresome ship captain in Apalachicola starts a move to memorialize Dr. Gorrie, not only for the invention of ice, but also for the invention of the air conditioner. Two things that really make life in Florida possible. And it's thanks to this movement by the ice dealers of Apalachicola and other places that Dr. Gorrie is one of Florida's representatives in Statuary Hall in Washington, D.C. It's a kind of a puzzle because, of course, there are other folks who were involved in the invention of the ice machine, the French, for example. But Gorrie did have this idea. And like Tudor, he has an obsessive nature for getting this idea to fruition. Unlike Tudor, Gorrie is wildly unsuccessful. Tudor is a sharp-elbowed guy who is really adamant about running a business and driving his competition out of it. As I mentioned, other people were shipping ice to the tropics. And if one of Tudor's ships arrived and there was a ship from one of his rivals in port, he would sell his ice for a penny a pound. knowing that his competitors couldn't afford to do that. And of course, all of the competitors' ice would melt as Tudor is selling his ice hand over fist. And Tudor, as I said, also would give the ice away to bartenders so that people would acquire a taste for it. And they would learn how to use ice. And, if people are paying the same for a cold drink as they would for a warm one, well, they're definitely going to prefer the cold drink. So you have Tudor, who uses something that occurs naturally every winter. And in fact, here in New England and in most places that have ice, regarded as something of a nuisance, and turns it into an asset, turns it into a profit, which is what I guess we would call Yankee ingenuity, taking something, the only cost is extracting it from the ponds and shipping it to someplace where they don't have it. I mean, imagine going outside in Boston today and saying, I have ice to sell, or selling ice to Eskimos becomes a phrase. So you have that idea of extracting something that doesn't cost anything to produce, but is there and is going to occur naturally, and finding a way to ship it to another part of the world, to Honolulu or to Trinidad or Martinique or Hong Kong or Calcutta. And then you have our friend Dr. Gorrie, who's trying to figure out a way to keep his patients cool, and winds up creating a machine that will not only cool the air, but will also produce ice. These are really extraordinary American stories that help us to understand the development of an American system, or a system of enterprise, which both Gorrie and Tudor are part of, one more successfully than the other. And there's actually, someone just popped up in the chat about Wenham Lake. And Wenham Lake actually was a competitor with Frederic Tudor. Wenham Lake is north of Boston, and Wenham Lake ice becomes favored in Great Britain. Great marketing. In fact, much of this involves marketing, as I think Tudor's story shows. He was a better marketer than Dr. Gorrie was. And Tudor understood the power of a name. Folks at Wenham Lake, who really learned how to sell ice in England. And it was said that the ice was so clear, you could read the newspaper through a 2-foot block of Wenham Lake ice. It's yet another ploy of turning something that would be a negative into a positive. I could go on, but I know there are questions popping up. I will be happy to answer them. And thank you for joining us to keep cool, thinking about ice and about Frederic Tudor and Dr. John Gorrie and others. Now I'm happy to entertain your questions. Thank you.
So we have one question. It says, you mentioned that Tudor retrieved ice from various ponds around Boston. Would the fine ice from Wenham Lake also have been brokered by Tudor? And would he have been able to charge more for that ice? And what are the names for some of the other ponds he used?
Okay, the biggest pond he would have used initially was Fresh Pond in Cambridge. Big pond near Boston, easily accessible to Boston. Fresh Pond ice. Jamaica Pond, which is now in the city of Boston. Jamaica Pond is part of the Jamaica Plain neighborhood. These would have been the two big ones. In fact, Jamaica Pond was the first source of water for the city of Boston back in the 1600s, 1700s. But Fresh Pond, and that is where Wyeth he had overseen the Fresh Pond ice business. By the way, Nathaniel Wyeth was, I think, a great uncle of the artist N.C. Wyeth, the illustrator, and N.C. Wyeth was the father or grandfather of Andrew Wyeth. But you have Fresh Pond, and then you're going further afield, which is how Walden Pond comes into this, and other ponds. And virtually then every pond in the metropolitan Boston area, they would be cutting ice, even ponds up in Maine. As I said, very quickly, people see that this is something they can do, even though Tudor wants to have a monopoly on it. It was impossible, as different towns had ice. And Wenham Lake is a bit north of Boston, and not as accessible to Boston as it is to Salem. So other entrepreneurs are seeing an opportunity with this.
Thank you. Another question we have is, how did Americans get hooked on the idea that beer should be served ice cold?
Well, it's a lot better to serve it cold than it is to serve it at room temperature, even though they would have been having it at room temperature for a long time. It's developing a taste for it, just as you're developing a taste for cold cocktails. Thinking about this in Calcutta, people who have grown up there had no idea that you could have a drink cold, but in fact, you still drink hot tea in India and in other parts of Asia. So you're developing a taste, which is why Tudor is shipping the ice, and sometimes he will give the first cargo away. So people get a taste for this. And when the ice comes back, they're going to definitely buy it. He's learning how to market things. And if you didn't know that there was a difference, if you didn't know that you could have beer cold, why would you want it cold? But discovering that, yes, you do want it cold, it's a way of creating demand.
Another question we have is if there's any more information about the teaching recipes to bartenders, and or specifically the smash drink that you
Yes. Yeah. Okay. The smash drink. First, you chill the glass. That's one very important piece of this. And then you put into a shaker sugar, water, some kind of alcohol, rum or spirits, and ice. And you shake that up and you strain it into a glass that also has ice in it. And it proves to be very refreshing. Now, I don't know if the term smashed for drunkenness comes from this particular drink, but it is a popular cocktail in the 19th century. Creating a demand for something, spirits that are chilled as opposed to spirits that are warm, warm toddies, hot toddies, but now you have a cold toddy. It's actually much more refreshing than a warm one. At least that's been my experience.
Great. Another question we have is, given the sanitation back then, were there ever issues of pond ice spreading illness?
That's a very good question, and unfortunately, I don't know the answer to it. It would be interesting to know. Of course, it's frozen, which I think does kill bacteria, but then, of course, it's being packed into ships for a long time. So I don't think there were the same issues as there might have been. At least there was never any paper trail leading us back to Frederic Tudor if there was an outbreak of cholera in some place caused by the pond ice. It's a good question, and I think something that should make us cautious.
Great. We have some more questions about kind of the ice itself. Was it more like cubed ice or shaved ice? Was it harder ice, or was it more soft?
Well, you're getting a block of ice, and then you're probably using a hammer and a chisel to break off pieces of it. So you're not making nice little cubes of ice from this, but instead you're getting chips of ice and pieces of ice. Now, the ice itself is being shipped, as I said, in these blocks. By the way, another thing that we're developing in the early 19th century are ice boxes or ice chests, where you could put a block of ice and keep something cold. And usually these are made out of mahogany, tropical wood, which becomes a favorite for making ice chests, which would be pretty much, if you're familiar with a fisherman's chest, where he has or a chest to hold beer or something on that idea. The home refrigerator comes in a little bit later. By the way, the reason most refrigerators still have the freezer on top is because that's where you would have the block of ice. As ice becomes a business, I know I'm getting far afield from these good questions about what the ice actually looked like. You have home delivery of ice in places like New Orleans or Augusta or Apalachicola. You have an iceman bringing a block of ice, putting it in this refrigerator, putting it in the top, and then there's a tube that will bring as the ice melts. And by the way, as it's melting, it's absorbing the heat. That's why it's melting, and that's what makes the refrigerator work. And you have a tube going down into a basin at the bottom, underneath it, a tray that has to be emptied regularly because the ice is melting. It'll melt over the course of a week or so. So you have people beginning to use blocks of ice, and it would have come in a block. And then some of the ice, would get soft. And people were used, by the way, to using snow to keep things cool. And that naturally would be more like slush as we know it. And so the ice itself isn't going to be in small cubes. You're not going to get a bag of cubes. You're going to get a block of ice if you're purchasing ice, whether it's coming from a pond in New England or whether it's coming from a machine in New Orleans or some other place.
Great, thank you. Another question we have is, what was the return use of Tudor ships once the ice had been delivered? Were they used for cotton or sugar back to Boston, or were they used on other goods or routes?
Well, that's a very good question, because the reason Tudor gets into this business is because Asia, Martinique, these other places have things that we want to buy, but we don't really have anything they want to buy. That was really the big problem. That is, sugar is in demand here, mahogany is in demand here, but our codfish isn't really in demand there. And the other goods, I mean, Massachusetts did produce shoes and starts producing textiles, but those aren't in as high demand as the sugar or the mahogany would be, or the goods from India, the spices, tea, other things being produced in India or in China are of much more value here than much more value to us than anything we had were to them. So the purpose of this isn't to send a shipload of ice and then just bring back money, although that's a good thing, but also to bring back the goods of India, China, the West Indies. And that is really the purpose, to bring cargoes back that we can sell here. And, you know, if you have a ship going halfway around the world empty, it's not really benefiting you. So look at what's being produced in those places. So in China, it's tea, silk, other goods. And in India, it's also textiles. India had been the center for textile production. In fact, some American ships are going to India bringing cotton, and American cotton is in higher demand, or American manufactured cloth comes to be in higher demand in India and in other parts of Asia than England. England is becoming the dominating power in producing woven cloth in the 19th century. American textiles, and of course, New England is the center of the textile industry at this time. So look at whatever goods are being produced there. I mean, and in the case of New Orleans or Apalachicola, a shipment of ice brought down there is going to come back with a load of cotton for the textile mills of New England. So the cotton produced in Florida, in the Florida Panhandle, or in Alabama, Georgia, or in Louisiana, Mississippi, is going to come back on these ships that have brought ice down to the Gulf Coast.
Great, thank you. Another question we have is about more detail on the chemicals or the process used in those like ice machines.
Okay, Carré's first go at producing this used ether, the same substance, you know, thinking different gases. And then the later one uses ammonia. Ammonia is the gas being used as the refrigerant. And when Carré patents this in the 1860s, using ammonia gas to expand and contract. Gorrie was using water, actually, or water and air. And that differential didn't work as efficiently as these other gases would. Again, I apologize, I'm not a scientist, but you know, using different gases. 18th century, the natural philosophers were discerning that air is composed of lots of different gases, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, and that each of these has different properties. And so these natural philosophers, they would start calling themselves scientists in the 19th century, are following up on the work of people from the 18th century, Lavoisier and Dr. Priestley, who isolated oxygen and nitrogen in the 18th century, and following up on this to determine the different properties of these gases and how they expand and contract at different temperatures, and what's the most efficient way of doing this. So the short answer is Carré uses ammonia as the refrigerant in his experiment, and Gorrie was simply using air. And actually had a steam engine working on this. It seems counterintuitive to use a steam engine to cool things down, but again, the engine is located somewhere else.
Thank you. We have another question about if daiquiris actually came from the availability of this ice.
Oh yes, in fact, yes. as well as the things that are in daiquiris, strawberries, other things. I mean, strawberries don't keep very, very long. And so having the ice, and actually in this case, it's going to be, you're going to smash the ice to make a daiquiri. You didn't have a blender then. You would have to do this, a lot of this by hand. But yes, a lot of the drinks we have, I mean, the smash is one of the drinks introduced because there is ice available, which certainly would have been impossible to have a drink. Well, obviously with ice, there is no such thing as ice if we don't know how to either manufacture it or where to get it. If you're in Calcutta and you think about the drinks associated with places in the tropics, which do rely on ice, it's again, should make us rethink, I guess, a lot of things.
Great, thank you. Seems we have one more question. It says, you mentioned carry trade in connection with the ice being shipped, and so how did that process sort of work?
Okay, so this is simply Tudor is first leasing ships and then buying ships, and their real purpose is to carry ice. And so carrying ice from Boston and Tudor Wharf, as I said, becomes one of the most important wharves in Boston Harbor. Now there's a nice hotel on Tudor Wharf, and shipping the ice to another place where the ice will be sold into an ice house, but then buying things to bring back. And the carrying trade is simply carrying things from one place to another. New England, as I said, didn't have any real raw materials that it could export to other places. And so the New Englanders become very imaginative in how they will survive. I mentioned the codfish. You know, the cod, they didn't come here realizing, boy, there are a lot of cod here and we can sell them somewhere else. There were other folks who were already catching the cod, including the native people here. And the word for cod, bacaloa in the Basque language, is the same as the word for cod in the Algonquian languages of northern North America. So you have this fish that's becomes really central to this economy, so central that in the 1700s, someone makes a 5-foot-long wooden codfish to hang in the Massachusetts State House. It hangs in the House of Representatives chamber, so everyone can remember how important the cod is. That cod is still hanging in the State House of Representatives. After 250 plus years, that codfish is still there. It was so central to this. And the top of the Massachusetts State House, and I apologize for talking so much about Massachusetts to a group in North Carolina, has a pine cone, the pine cone representing the forests of Maine, because we had a lot of trees we could use to make ships and barrels to carry stuff around. Not stuff that we are necessarily making, but carrying, say, codfish from here to the West Indies, getting sugar there, bringing that somewhere else, or bringing codfish to the Mediterranean and trading it in different places in the Mediterranean for olives or wine or other goods, bringing those back. So simply developing a whole system of commerce, which is why, by the way, the term Yankee comes to mean a shrewd businessman, probably an unpleasant person who's always looking to make a buck out of you. You know, that's what the term Yankee originally meant. There are different ideas about where the term came from, but this idea of a shrewd bargainer was one. And so these are guys who set out to sell things. And that is essential to the New England economy, not having any raw materials, that, not being able to produce tobacco or sugar or the other commodities that were really in value. The New Englanders figure out a way to trade things to people, things that maybe they didn't have, that the New Englanders might not have produced, but they figure out a way to sell them in someplace else.
Great, thank you. We have time for one more question, which was, did Tudor maintain ice houses in New England to be able to ship ice year round? And also, are there other, do you have any recommendations on books or other readings available for this topic in general?
That's a very good question. There are some good readings. I was just reading a great article in the New England Quarterly about Tudor and Savage. There's not really a good book on all of this. I think there should be. And I think this is a market for some of you avid historians out there to think about. This could be a good topic to write about because Tudor left a lot of papers interesting guy and represents something. There was a book called The Ice King some years ago. But in the other question, yes, he did maintain ice houses. In fact, that would be part of it. Initially, as he sends the first shipment off in February, because that's when there is ice. But of course, if you can send ice at other times of the year, that's actually beneficial. So yes, building ice houses. And in fact, on Tudor Wharf, there was an enormous ice house. And also, if you go along the coast of New England, you'll note that there are a lot of cold storage buildings that would have been associated with the fishing trade. I mentioned salted codfish was the real staple, but then by the 19th century, we're using these blocks of ice actually to keep fish cool. And it's in the time of the Civil War, we are developing refrigeration as a way of keeping things cool. Actually, the French are among the first to develop ships that are big refrigerators to keep things cool, not using ice, but using these artificial techniques. So yeah, Tudor is maintaining ice houses and others are maintaining bigger ice houses. A lot of places, like I mentioned, Mount Vernon had an ice house. Robert Morris in Philadelphia built an ice house in his place in the 1780s or so. So yeah, ice is something that can be stored, they realize. That's the first step. And if you can store it, why can't you ship it? So then why can't you store it in Boston and then ship it out, in the middle of the summer when there's going to be more demand in other places instead of just having the ice is just here for a short time. Also building ice houses in other parts of the world, in Calcutta and in Chennai and in Hong Kong and other places where you're Honolulu, where you'll have an ice house where they can store the ice as well, figuring out how to keep it and what to do with it when you get the block of ice home or critical things, which is all developing, it's a marketing plan.
Dr. Allison, I cannot thank you enough. This has been a really fascinating and awesome way for us to kick off this season of History and Highballs. So thank you. We really appreciate it.
Well, happy history and happy highballs. So thank you, Stacy.
And thank you to all of those of you who joined us this evening. We hope to see you at our next program, which actually happens to be our 23rd annual African American Cultural Celebration that's taking place at the museum on Saturday, January 27th. We kick off at 10:30 that morning. So we hope that we will see you then. To everybody else, I hope you have a lovely evening and we'll see you soon. Take care, everybody. Bye.